Our first speaker is James Moody, who's the Executive Director Development at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. He's a futurist. He's an author of a book called The Sixth Sense. You'll hear more about that. He's been the Young Australian of the Year in Science and Technology. He's been the Young Executive of the Year of the Australian Financial Review. He's a regular panellist on the ABC show The New Inventors. And what I have to tell you is that he is a warm and dynamic speaker, wise beyond his years. His title is Eco-Natives, Shaping Education in the Sixth Wave of Innovation. James, please.
Look, it's an honour and a pleasure to be here to talk to you all today. I must say that I'm not an expert in education by any means, and would never hate to think that I was, but I have been spending a lot of time thinking about innovation. My background is in this wonderful area called innovation theory, which is really about how society is going to shape and what things are going to be looking like in the future. Thank you very much. So today what I'd like to do is, in the time we have, is to share with you some thoughts that I have been having and a few other people have been having around where things might be going into the future, and then ask the question, what does our education system need to do in order to respond to that? Now, to really start off around that, really, I want to take you first on a journey from the last 200 years, ever since the Industrial Revolution, and then ask the question, what might the future look like? And there was a Russian economist, a guy called Kondratiev, who some of you may have heard of, that originally started looking at this. Interestingly, he ended up in a Russian gulag, which wasn't quite so good for poor Kondratiev, but happily some of his followers, such as Schumpeter and then Chris Freeman and others who started to look at this area, didn't come to quite such a sticky end. What Kondratiev identified was actually, since the Industrial Revolution, the pace of change has not been linear. It hasn't just continued on a regular progress. What's actually happened is it's been in waves. So for example, and these waves, you can see them right there. It started off with milling and water power, moved on to railways, moved on to electrification, then on to mass production, and then the information and communications technology wave that we've actually just been witnessing. And what happens in these waves, at the very beginning of a wave, you get a lot of disruption, a lot of new businesses being formed, a lot of new technologies. You can plot the number of patents being filed, for example. Towards the middle of a wave, you get dominant designs emerge. So that's AC power or Microsoft Windows. And at the end of a wave, you get a global depression. And curiously enough, here's a little bit of work done by Allianz, and I find it fascinating. We only ever really do this work at the end of a wave, never just before the end of a wave. But you can actually see this is the stock exchanges, the S&P 500 index for the last 200 years. It's the rolling 10-year yield, so it's the long-term signal. And what you can actually see there, the Industrial Revolution, we didn't actually have an S&P 500, understandably, but you can actually start to see those waves, and I find it very fascinating. And I guess the central piece that I'm going to start sharing with you, it's quite fascinating to look at those last two in particular, when the world's economy was starting to become a lot more coupled, and understanding that. And you can see the Great Depression there before the beginning of the fourth. We had the oil shocks in the 70s, which was wide but not very deep. And you can see right at the end there the global financial crisis. And indeed, I guess the very heart of what we're looking at is at the very heart a bold prediction. And prediction is a very dangerous game, but it's a bold prediction that perhaps we might be actually witnessing something you only ever see every 30 or 35 years, which is the transition from one wave of innovation to another. And the interesting reason why transitions are important, because one, yes, there is a lot of disruption, a lot of angst, but also a huge amount of opportunity. And it's the investments you make in technology and people and society during that transition point that actually put you in good stead for the next 30 or 35 or 40 years when you get back into that growth period. Now, we could dig into it, but really, if indeed the last wave of information technology, what would the sixth wave be? And I guess the central premise, and I don't have time to really dig into that too much because I want to talk about education, but the central prediction that we've been looking at is that actually the sixth wave, in the same way the fifth wave of innovation was all based on ICT and in fact around transaction cost. All those technologies we heard about a bit earlier, the mobile phones and so on, I'm not going to take mine out, I'm afraid. All those technologies were actually all about transaction costs and reducing transaction costs. around what we did, the next wave might actually be about resource efficiency. Why do I think that? Well, because we are entering almost a perfect storm of market factors, technology factors, and what they call institutional factors. For the market side, we're actually seeing a world where, scarcity is starting to increase. Here, and you can replay these sorts of curves in a lot of other areas. Here, for example, is just the decline, the ore grade, you might say, levels, and over the last 100 years or so. And you can actually see how they've been declining over time. You can look at petroleum. We've actually doubled our spend on petroleum exploration between 2008 and 2011. Doubled on a global scale. But in fact, the rate of actual finding new resources has halved. At the same time as we're seeing increasing scarcity, we're also starting to see increased areas of demand. Here's a little study that the World Economic Forum did around looking at what will happen around water demand around the world between 2005 and 2030. China, for example, was set to increase its demand by 61% from 2005. Now that's quite a reasonably big figure, but the same report actually then tried to take a stab at how much water we currently had, coming back to that scarcity piece. They identified that the current supply of reliable fresh water in the world was 4,500 billion cubic metres. Okay, remember that number, 4,500 billion cubic metres. The current consumption of fresh water around the world is 4,200 billion cubic metres. So we are already consuming, at this point in time, around 95% of the world's available fresh water. This is the scarcity piece. We're also seeing the demand in fresh water increase by 61% in China alone between those two periods. So from a market perspective, you can start to see what happens crunch time, you might say. And of course, this has influences on prices and so on. The second piece of that sort of perfect storm is we're also starting to see us wonder how the value of these things that previously didn't have a value before. What is the value of a tree? Right? How do you value a tree? Because in the current system, particularly if you're talking about, say, a tree in Brazil, the current way you value a tree is either how much money you get if you chop the tree down and sell the wood, or how much money you get if you chop the tree down and sell the land. But trees actually offer a whole lot of other values, whether it's the biodiversity that they harbour, whether it's the air, the carbon dioxide in the air that they convert to oxygen, whether it's the water that they purify, whether it's the amenity value that they give. And interestingly enough, one of the things we're starting to see, and the debate's been happening in Australia around carbon, we've been doing it in water for years, is actually how do we price these things that never were priced before? And what happens is you start to see how those institutional factors then start to affect the market factors as well. And then you get to the final piece of the perfect storm, and coming from an organisation like CSIRO, of course I cannot ignore that, which is the whole technology bit. Look, for example, just at what happened around the investment in technology following the global financial crisis in the US alone. This is the US investment in R&D spending. And you can see it overnight, it was trebled. In energy R&D spending. Overnight, we saw a trebling of investment. This is starting to get to we will go to the moon type stuff. And in fact, if you hear the secretary of that department talk, it really is we will go to the moon stuff. We want to get renewables equaling the cost of non-renewables. And then other large companies such as GE are also starting to invest in that space also as well. So what does all that mean? And then how does this lead into education? Well, basically, I guess the bold prediction is that actually, resource efficiency is a really shorthand way of saying that we're actually potentially moving from an old mode of operation to a new mode of operation. The old mode being where we've been harvesting resources that were plentiful and cheap, to one where we're going to be managing resources that are scarce and valuable. And in that shift, we start to see not only technologies change, and markets change, but even institutional mechanisms change. Now, there was a paper that was written by Mark Prensky that some of you may have come across, which is the notion of digital natives and digital immigrants. The thought that there is actually a generation that grew up, and I'd rephrase that, this is the generation that grew up in the fifth wave of innovation, really understanding what they might be. In the same sense, if you start to think about education, what might the next generation grow up? If indeed my bold prediction is correct, that we are seeing a transition from one wave of innovation to the next, and it will move from being driven by transaction cost to resource efficiency. Well, interestingly, in the same sense, and this is something we sort of put a bit of a feeler out for in the book that we were writing, was actually maybe we're not going to be such digital natives. And of course, the digital natives still continue, but maybe the next generation are actually going to grow up to be much more eco-natives, or whatever you might call it. It's probably a bit of a hackneyed term there. But basically, if you start thinking about these eco-natives, then you start to understand what are the skill sets, what are the educational systems that you need to actually start to help those eco-natives in their journal, and what will their demands be? Because as we know, education is always two-way. It's always about motivation as well as supply. Now, in the book, to try to shape this, we actually came up with 5 rules of thumb. We came up with 5 ways in which a world which is shaped by limited resources, in a world where we're actually transitioning from harvesting resources to managing resources. And by answering the question really around what would education look like in the future, it's best to actually start to go through each of those. The first, of course, is probably an obvious thing, but to anybody who's... So it's basically that waste equals opportunity. Our systems are very wasteful at the moment. 40% of the food that we grow and comes out of the ground does not make it into anyone's mouth. 40% of it actually gets lost in the production process. 85% of the energy in our internal combustion engine does not actually get used to move you forward. It actually goes into heat and light. And we're starting to see how education curriculums... I used to sit on a thing called the National Environmental Education Council for about 5 years, and this is way back in the late 90s. And there we used to talk about mainstreaming this sort of stuff. Well, interestingly, that council, I don't think it's reinvented it a few times because mainstreaming has occurred. We've got sustainable schools, we've got carbon kits, we've got all these things. Schools are realising that incorporating things into the curriculum is a good way of motivating and educating kids. Curiously enough, it's not just about waste, because if you think about it, waste can be in multiple ways. There's waste around the energy that we might be heating this room up with that we other can't. But what about all the waste? We're all sitting here. What about your car? Who's driving your car, for example? Right? Here's a capital asset that's not sitting there. And what we're noticing is that basically we're starting to see a shift in this world towards services, where it's actually more about access than ownership. Car sharing, for example, there's GoGet in Sydney. 10 families use a single vehicle. Right? That's a 10-to-1 improvement efficiency. And we're actually starting to see, for example, young kids in the US, there's a big trend towards taking public transport rather than driving a car, because you can tweet on the bus. Right? You don't want to waste the time driving. Jeez. So interesting, this shift towards services as a way of getting resource efficient, but also, and we heard some talk about this in the first session, as a way of creating additional value. Our economy is already 85% services. Our value-added GDP is 85% services. We often don't think of that. But actually we've seen that shift, and moving from product to service to even to experience is a critical area. So how do we teach kids to live in a world where services and access, it's about access to the information. You don't have to own the Encyclopedia Britannica and so on. The third rule of thumb, and it's interesting when you think about this, is previously it was it was about trying to get things online. Well, you're going to start hearing a lot more about digital and natural convergence. Soon everything, whether it's this microphone, whether it's the light switch, whether it's myself, whether it's this hotel, they will all start to have a digital counterpart. That microphone will have a radio frequency ID tag in it. The light switch will be connected to the smart grid. I've got my mobile phone, which is already my digital counterpart. It knows where I am. Soon it will have my wallet and my keys. It'll know whether I'm alive. The hotel will have a building management system. All those things, and IBM calls it, the intelligent, instrumented, and interconnected world. And in terms of the skills you need to move in that world, it's quite different. You need to be able to multitask. You need to be able to synthesize information. There's no one answer. It's not the encyclopedia or even the Wikipedia answer anymore. It's about trying to find the 10 sources and working out which 7 of those are probably right, or whether they're actually together. That whole notion of collecting data and synthesizing it becomes critical. This then leads into the fourth rule of thumb, I should say, which is the outlook rule. If you're actually in a world where we're seeing digital and natural converge, we start to work out that the bits are global, that the information is more and more global. You know, I've got one of those wonderful little Apple TV things, and it's got, I think, 12,000 radio stations or whatever. They call it the long tail. You can source information from anywhere. Yet we spend so much energy and so much time transferring stuff and shipping atoms around. That's all going to start to become more and more local. And I guess the implications for this for our curriculum are things like, you know, how global are we in our outlook, but how deeply in our local community are we putting the application? And those two things, getting that balance right, they're called globalization or other things, getting that balance right in our educational curriculum will be critical. And then the final rule of thumb is basically this. It's almost the catch-all. It's if in doubt, look to nature. Because it's interesting, all those other things that I just talked about around resource efficiency, around selling services, you know, natural systems actually already do that. Natural systems don't do two-way chemical don't do one-way chemical reactions. They always do two-way chemical reactions. They take waste from one system and use it as feedstock for another system. We're actually already starting to see natural systems impart themselves from a shopping centre in Africa that was built using the thermal principles of a termite mound and 10% of the efficiency of the next door shopping centre. But really what that means is that basically all those principles in nature, whether it's from adaptivity, as we saw from Simon McKeon earlier today, you know, how do you adapt? How do you actually integrate? How do you interconnect? Because natural systems deal with interconnections. How do you deal with complexity, but just enough complexity, all become very critical. You know, the future in this world then becomes a very interesting one, because if indeed we are on a cusp from one wave of innovation to another, it does mean that we need to start thinking of things slightly differently than before. That's the first thing to learn. But the final thought is this. For the last 200 years, we have seen our economy and economic growth tightly coupled from resource to resource consumption. Right? That has been the rule of thumb from the Industrial Revolution. In fact, the Industrial Revolution was the thing that decoupled economic growth from number of hours worked. Right? That's what we did. We basically used machines to decouple the number of hours worked from economic growth, and that's why things like labour productivity become important. If indeed the story now is that we're going to decouple economic growth from resource consumption, what's left? What gets left? The two things get left is human time, to create value, sorry. What's left to create value? Two things are left are human time and human ingenuity or creativity. And any education system that doesn't recognise that those two things become the critical factors in prosperity and growth is not one that will put us in good stead for this wave of innovation and for the future. So, thank you very much. Thank you.